Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Tom.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
It's our news unit today. It's also our all-English lecture, so we're going to be speaking mostly in English. Well, actually, we're supposed to speak entirely in English today, and that's going to be good for your listening comprehension ability. So bear with us here and pay attention. And what exactly are we going to talk about today?
Ooh. This is really important. We're going to be talking about domestic violence and a piece of legislation has passed. Domestic violence refers to violence that happens in the home. So maybe the dad hitting the wife or the mom hitting the dad, or maybe one of the parents hitting kids, hurting the kids. Violence is always bad, but it's especially awful when it's in your own home, in your family, where you should feel, protected and safe.
Indeed. And because in Taiwan society it's kind of considered private matter, if you're having family problems or something, it's not something that the police are supposed to get involved in. At least that's what a lot of people think. So they had to fight really hard to get this law passed. And so we're going to be talking about the Domestic Violence Act. And it was enacted into law 20 years ago. So we're marking the 20th anniversary of this particular law. So let's find out what this is all about. Let's read through the entire contents of our lesson now, one time. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Taiwan's Domestic Violence Prevention Act. The law was the first of its kind in Asia. Lawmakers first proposed this legislation after the 1993 case of Deng Ruwen made headlines. Deng and her family members had long suffered violent abuse at the hands of her husband. Hard as she tried to get relief from the authorities, she never received assistance. In the end, Deng resorted to killing her husband to keep herself and her family safe. Multiple other factors were cited as reasons for the law's necessity. At the time, domestic abuse was considered a family affair rather than an issue for the criminal justice system. Consequently, police hesitated to arrest abusers, and if cases did make it to court, judges rarely offered victims any help. Further complicating matters was the patriarchal system predominant in Taiwanese society and the belief that a wife and children were merely a husband's property. Unfortunately, both these problems endure to this day. Even today, abuse victims, 70% of whom are women, face hurdles when attempting to escape domestic violence. Under the law, the government is required to provide psychological care, short and long-term shelter, financial assistance, and much more to people leaving violent homes. However, organizations tasked with these jobs are often overburdened by shortages of funds and staff. Without the appropriate resources, abuse victims may lack the money they need to escape and find refuge. Domestic violence has now been a criminal offense for 20 years in Taiwan. Unfortunately, however, there are still roughly 120,000 cases of domestic abuse reported every year. There's still much to be done to protect the people living under these terrible circumstances.
Let's get started. Remember, this is our all-English lecture. So Tom and I will try to speak a little slower today. And if we do use words that are not in the lesson, then one of us should define what that word actually means. I know sometimes we use words and we don't tell you what they mean. Hopefully, we've said them clearly enough that you could at least look them up. We're talking about domestic violence. We've added this word act. If you're talking about anything that's considered to be an act, some sort of law that's been passed by the government. In the States, it's the Congress that passes laws. Here we've got the legislative yuan that makes and passes laws. Here we're talking about the 20th anniversary of a really important piece of legislation, and that's the Taiwan Domestic Violence Prevention Act. So that was pretty important 20 years ago. Actually, I have a Taiwanese friend who was a victim of domestic violence. Yeah, it's something that people don't like to talk about very much. and sometimes they don't tell anybody else. And it was hard for her to leave the marriage, but she did. She got out, and now she and her kids are fine. But it can be pretty awful if you've experienced it yourself or have family or friends that have gone through this.
Okay, so it's been 20 years, so we're talking about the 20th anniversary of the passing of this law, and it was the first of its kind in Asia. Okay, so maybe they've had other laws passed in other countries since then, but this was the first one in the continent of Asia, and lawmakers first proposed it after the 1993 case of Deng Ruwen. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. That particular case made headlines. So this phrase here, to make headlines, just means it becomes news, and it becomes really widespread news, well-known news. To make headlines means it's suddenly known in the news by lots of people.
I wanted to mention legislation. This is one of our vocabulary words. Legislation is non-count, guys. We can't say, ooh, we passed a lot of legislations. No. We need a measure word if we're going to talk about a particular law or a particular act like we are today. So typically we'll say this piece of legislation passed back in like 20 years ago. That's a long time ago. So legislation, it's very similar to what I was saying about act. It's just some laws considered to be important that pass in your branch, whatever it is, your department of legislation, people who sit around that you elect to represent you, that sit around and try to think of ways to help society by passing new laws. Then we have to obey that are enacted and put into practice. And usually if you disobey or you go against one of these laws or pieces of legislation, you might get arrested for breaking the law.
You might indeed. So this case happened before the law was passed. If you can do your mathematics correctly, I believe the law would have been passed in 1999. That's 20 years ago. So this case happened in 1993, which was 6 years before the law was passed. So there was no law when this woman was suffering from domestic abuse. And Deng and her family members had long suffered violent abuse at the hands of her husband. So yes, Deng herself had suffered the abuse, and family members had as well. It doesn't say specifically what the family members were or who they were. Could have been her children. It may have been her parents if they were living together or something like that. I don't know the details of this case, but we should sort of define the word abuse here. That's a noun. That just refers when somebody is violated or they are beat or taken poor care of. Abuse. And of course, you can talk about abusing something if you're talking about a verb there. It means misusing something. You're not using it in the way that you're supposed to be, usually in a bad way. Again, some politicians abuse their power and take bribes and help their friends and stuff. But again, as I said, the word abuse here is a noun. It just refers to the act of someone being abused.
I wanted to mention here, we're talking about violent abuse. It's possible that you could also be abused in a different way, and that would be verbal. Verbal means they aren't actually hitting you physically. Violent actually refers to being physically hurt by someone. Yeah, someone could call you names or make you feel really stupid. That's verbal abuse. That can be really damaging as well. At the hands of. This phrase is used to talk about who was doing the abusing, and here it just refers to her husband. It could be at the hands of her uncle, at the hands of her grandfather. Could be different people that are listed there, but here we know it was the husband who was abusing Deng and other family members. Hard as she tried to get relief from the authorities, she never received assistance. Hard as she tried. It's a phrase we use sometimes to talk about no matter what she did, no matter who she talked to or what number she called. You know, at the police station, no one was there to help her. Authorities refer to people who have some sort of power. Could be people who work in the government. It could be the police who have a lot of power as well. But people who are referred to as the authorities have power to give orders that must be made, that must be obeyed. I mean, they can enforce laws. These are the authorities.
Yeah, if somebody sneaks into your house, you can say, hey, if you don't leave, the proper authorities will have to be called. You're going to have to scram. You're going to have to get out of here. And again, those are the authorities, police, or whatever government officials. I did want to go back to this phrase, hard as she tried, and just give you an example sentence here. Once upon a time in the past, I tried to study Russian, and it's just such a hard language. So hard as I studied, I just couldn't learn Russian. It was just too hard. So I gave up and started studying Chinese instead. So no matter how hard she tried to get relief from the authorities, she just couldn't receive any assistance. They just did not want to help her. That's your affair. That's your problem. Leave us out of it. We've got other things to do. And in the end, Deng resorted to killing her husband to keep herself and her family safe. So in the end, finally, as a last resort, she killed her husband. So here we've got the phrase resorted to. That means she chose this particular action.
And usually this word is used when you're in a really difficult situation and what you choose to do is really bad. It's not something that you want to do, but you feel like you have no other choices except this one thing. So you had to resort to doing this thing. One time I had no kind of tasty food in my apartment. All the stores were closed and I had to resort to eating a can of tuna with nothing else. It was pretty awful. Yeah. Wow. So, yeah, sometimes you have to resort to doing things you don't want to because you don't have any other option at that time.
Indeed, a common usage of this word is to resort to violence. That seems to be the place it's most often used. So she did resort to violence here, or she resorted to murder. She actually killed her husband to keep herself and her family safe. It sounds to me like it was killing in self-defense, however. I wish I knew how this case turned out.
Or what the laws are here. I don't even know if they can plead, self-defense. So, yeah, it's really kind of sad. I didn't live here then, so I don't know what happened, and now I'm curious. So I hope she was treated fairly by the courts.
That was, around the time of the big earthquake back in 1999. I was here, but when the earthquake struck, I actually had taken a trip to the U.S. and heard about the earthquake when I was there.
But this was 1993.
Oh, well, that's when
that's
when the case made headlines, but the law, I guess, was enacted in 1999. Yeah. But in any case, this is all way in the past here. And so she had to resort to violence to keep herself and her family safe. So, yeah, I'd like a little bit of an update there. Where the heck is she now? And did she have to serve any jail time or whatever? That might be very interesting information here. And we've got just a minute or so to move on to the next paragraph here. So let's do that. Multiple other factors were cited as reasons for the law's necessity. So multiple, many other factors, many other reasons were cited, or they were mentioned, or they were noted as reasons for the necessity of the law. In other words, they said, yes, we need this law, not just because of the case of Deng Ruwen, but for other reasons as well.
Right now, guys, we're going to take a quick break, but we don't have a Chinese teacher. You're just going to, come back to us again after we have a little bit of a break.
Okay, welcome back. We'll continue with our lesson now. Where we left off, we were talking about the case of Deng Ruwen and the Domestic Violence Prevention Act. This is the 20th anniversary. And lots of people thought, yes, we need to protect people who are suffering violence in marriages or in families. But many other reasons were cited as reasons for the necessity of the law. Now, at the time, in the 1990s, domestic abuse was considered a family affair rather than an issue for the criminal justice system. So they thought, yes, this is a private concern. It doesn't involve us. You guys take care of that yourselves. If someone's beating up the other person in a marriage, that's your problem. You're going to have to deal with it. Sorry, we can't do anything. Our hands are tied.
Right. We're using her situation as a kind of a basis to look back at this law. So what happens when nobody helps you? I'm afraid this is something I would do too. If I couldn't get anyone to help me, I might end up killing my husband, especially if he was hurting my children. I might think about that. You want to keep your kids safe. I know moms will do just about anything to protect their kids. So there were multiple other factors as cited for reasons for the law's necessity, why they needed it. Like Tom said, at the time, your family affairs were private. You couldn't just call the police and say, hey, something bad's happening here. You gotta come help me. So consequently, because of this, police hesitated to arrest abusers. And if cases did make it to court, judges were rarely sympathetic to the victim. So, yeah, if you hesitate, you just kind of keep yourself back for a bit. It's something you don't want to do, but eventually you do it. You hesitate. I hesitate sometimes to tell my dad what he should do when I think it's very clear the decisions he should make because he's an adult. He should make his own decisions. But sometimes I really want to tell him, but I hesitate before I say anything because I don't want to hurt his feelings.
And, you can't hesitate too much if you're trying to get through traffic during rush hour. If you hesitate, the other person is going to get ahead of you and you'll be stuck behind. You'll miss the green light and they'll get to go on when you're stuck there waiting for 2 minutes. But in any case here, yes, the police will hesitate to arrest them. Yeah, my husband beat me. Yeah, but we're not going to arrest him. Again, that's a family affair. But, if the police did arrest somebody, they would later take the case to court, but the judges rarely offered victims any help. The judges, of course, were probably not too concerned. They probably said, well, your husband beat you? Well, you must have done something to deserve it. You must have made a poor dinner for the hardworking man or something like that. They probably heard stuff like that, so the judges simply threw the cases out of court.
I wanted to mention Deng actually was helped by some women's groups back then. Turns out she was sentenced to only 3 years in jail. And she custody of her kids back after she served 3 years in prison. So it could have been worse for her. They could have sentenced to life in prison or given her the death penalty for murder. So at least back then we had some women's organizations who were trying to help and come to her aid, A-I-D, aid, as in help. Further complicating matters was, and because this is past tense, was the patriarchal system was predominant in Taiwanese society. Patriarchal refers to when men have the power in whatever system you're talking about. We know in Japan, in the homes, it's a matriarchal system, meaning the women have the power in the home. But here in Taiwan, especially back then, it was a patriarchal system, meaning the men had all the power. Predominant means it was dominating the Taiwanese society back then. Not in every home, certainly, but predominant means it was definitely in most of the homes where the men had all the power.
Yep, it was common, it was widespread in society here in Taiwan, and the belief that a wife and children were merely a husband's property. Okay, so that was part of the system here. Yes, I've heard that before. Daughters are married out, okay, so they tend to stress the boys. They're going to take over the family business and stuff like that. The daughter is just going to go live with somebody else and be their property. So yeah, they're merely the property of the husband, or they're the property of the husband's family, maybe the actual property of the dreaded mother-in-law.
Oh, I hate that idea where women are someone's property. Not all families are easy, as we all know. Even families you think are perfect have some problems. So yeah, even today, I know we have this law, but there still might be families that are suffering through domestic violence. Now, unfortunately, it says here, both these problems endure to this day. So they still exist to this day. They haven't completely gone away. I mentioned a friend of mine. She's a generation younger than me, and she had to go through some hard times before she was able to get a divorce. So it's still tough. So even today, this is 1, 2, 3, the third paragraph. Abuse victims, 70% of whom are women, face hurdles when attempting to escape domestic violence. If you're talking about a hurdle, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the sport of track and field. Those folks that are athletes that like to run either short distances or long distances. There's one event called the hurdles where they have to jump over these obstacles in the way. My brother participated in hurdles. I thought those were fun but dangerous because if you fell, you always really hurt your knees pretty badly. But here we're not talking about the sport where these hurdles are used. We're talking about some sort of obstacle, something that gets in your way from continuing forward. After typhoons, we often have trees that fall and are down in the roads. And so that's a big obstacle. And in order to actually use that road again, we have to have people come and remove the tree so that hurdle is no longer there, that people can drive normally. So quite a few of the victims, 70%, are women, and they're trying to escape domestic violence, but it's not always easy.
The remaining 30% are probably children or maybe even men in some cases. It can happen.
It can.
But in any case, if you're a victim of domestic violence, you have a lot of hurdles to overcome and you want to escape that domestic violence. And under the law, the government is required to provide psychological care, short and long-term shelter, financial assistance, and much more to people leaving violent homes. So this law says, yes, the government needs to provide psychological care, and then they need also to provide shelter. Shelter, of course, is a place of protection. It could be an actual place that you can go live in, but it could also be some kind of protection, maybe giving you some money or something so that you can rent a place outside of the home to get away from the violence. So shelter basically is protection.
I wanted to mention something that we see in this sentence that Tom was talking about, short and long term. Notice that short has a small hyphen after it. Typically, it would be short hyphen term and long hyphen term, shelter. To make the writing faster and so that we don't have to repeat words, which we hate in English, although you guys love to repeat words, you like to say, you're emphasizing things. We hate that in English. So notice we're just going to drop the term. So short hyphen lets us know there's a word missing. And if you look next to it, you know it's term. So short-term and long-term shelter can be rewritten short hyphen and long-term shelter, and everyone knows what that means. So we've got organizations who are tasked with these jobs. If you're tasked with something, it's kind of hard to say, means you have that piece of work assigned to you. So organizations that are working on helping these domestic violence victims are tasked with these jobs of helping them. They're often overburdened. Why? Well, they don't have enough money and their staff isn't large enough. Those are common problems, especially in government organizations, but also in charitable organizations that are referred to as NGOs, non-governmental organizations that get their funds through donations from good people. If you're overburdened, you have too much. You can't do it all. Sometimes we all feel overburdened by work, don't we?
We do. A burden, of course, is something that slows you down, but you're responsible for it and you have to deal with it. So overburdened means they've just got too much other stuff to do. And, of course, they're overburdened by lack of money, shortages of funds, and they don't have enough people. They don't have enough staff. They probably don't have good enough salaries, and there aren't enough volunteers or whatever. So without the appropriate resources, abuse victims may lack the money they need to escape and find refuge. So even though we do have this law, it still suffers, or the government still suffers, from shortages of funds and staff. So yeah, you still might be in trouble if you're the victim of domestic violence. Hopefully lots of women's groups or whatever out there can help you with your problems. Now, moving on to the next paragraph here.
Oh, before we move on, I just wanted to mention this word refuge and shelter are very similar. It's a place where you can go, that you can feel safe there. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a building. It could be something that gives you shelter from a typhoon. Maybe the wind's getting strong and you find a little place where you can stand that shields you from the wind. Yeah, so refuge, shelter, very similar.
Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph, it says, domestic violence has now been a criminal offense for 20 years in Taiwan. So an offense here, okay, that's the word that is highlighted in this sentence here. Offense, that just means when you break the law, basically. So it's an offense, it's the noun here, a criminal offense, a criminal act, I guess you could say. And it's been so for 20 years. So yeah, if you're going to beat up your spouse, people, watch out. You might end up in jail.
Hopefully no one out there listening has plans to beat up your spouse. That's a bad thing. Yeah, I'm glad that it's actually a criminal offense now. It's interesting that we actually had to pass a law for it to be a criminal act to hit somebody and hurt someone in your family. Seems like that's pretty obvious. You shouldn't be doing that stuff. But yeah, we have to focus on that a lot more. Unfortunately, however, there are still roughly 120,000 cases of domestic abuse reported every year. It's quite high just for this one country of Taiwan, I would say. Roughly means we don't know the exact number. We probably don't have the exact number because there are many of these offenses that are committed, these crimes that are committed that are never reported. And actually, some ladies I've seen will pick up the phone, call the police will come to their home, and they'll say, "Oh, no, nothing happened." You know, it's very scary for some of these ladies or husbands to leave their family because that's usually what ends up happening. They have to get a divorce, have to leave to protect the kids if they have children. But yeah, a lot of the ladies who are actually hurt, especially if they show up to the hospital and they have a broken bone and bruises all over their faces, they'll be asked by hospital, "Is someone beating you? Is something happening?" They'll often just deny it. "Oh no, I fell down the stairs."
I know in the States, though, they're required to investigate that if, they go into hospitals and stuff like that.
Hospitals do, yeah.
I don't know if that's the case here in Taiwan. If you're the nurse in the ER and you suspect that injury was incurred as a result of domestic violence, are you supposed to report it to the police? I'm not quite sure how the law works. Hopefully they do report it, but there's still much to be done to protect the people living under these terrible conditions. So even though the law has been passed, the problem still persists, everybody. So you need to be on the lookout for that. And my goodness, if you suspect your neighbors are beating each other up or something like that, don't hesitate to call the police. At least maybe you could be anonymous about it.
Yeah, I would do that. Well, that's the end of our lesson today. We hope you learned quite a bit, that you'll take a little bit of time and review these vocabulary words and these phrases. And we hope it helps you either, get promoted in your jobs at work, or get a better grade on test, kids. So for English Digest, I'm Stephanie.
I'm Tom. Goodbye.
Bye.